Welcome to All About Owls. My name is Jennifer White with the Portage Park District, and I'm so happy that you can join us here tonight. We are going to learn a whole lot about owls. I'm not sure if all the things, but we're going to learn a lot tonight. So I've got a lot of information to pack into the program tonight, and I hope that you'll walk away with a better appreciation for these majestic creatures and also some tips on how to locate them and how to respectfully observe them and what to listen for when you're out enjoying the parks. And I'm excited to have some more eyes on the trail so that we can get some reports back about who you're seeing out there. So no pun in, well, maybe pun intended. Hoo. So we're going to get started, and I hope you enjoy tonight. Again, put any of your questions in the Q&A and put any comments or hellos over in the chat box. So here we go. First and foremost, this is Albert, our mascot at the Portage Park District, and Albert has an owl agenda. I just want to go through really quick what we're going to be covering tonight. First, I'm going to be going over some general and spending quite a bit of time actually on some general physical adaptations that are shared by most members of the owl group. We're also going to talk a little more detail about our 4 nesting owls in the state of Ohio, 3 of which regularly nest in Portage County. I'm also going to show you some info about 4 other species of owls that regularly are seen throughout the state, either during migration or who are winter visitors. Most of those have already started to head back north, so we're nearing the end or have missed that window to see those 4, but now you'll know about them and you'll be on the lookout for them come November when they start to visit the area again. There are 4 other owls that we won't be covering tonight that have sighting records in the state of Ohio, but they're so rare and so few and far between that we're not going to cover those tonight. And then finally, I'm going to close with some tips on how to locate owls, where to look, and also how to respectfully and ethically observe them. So thanks so much for joining. I love all birds. I particularly love owls, and I think a lot of others do because they're one of those just mysterious, magical creatures. I think some of it has to do with the fact that most of them are only active at night, so there's just a little mystery right there. And they've got that human eye look to them, right? So let's start with the eyes. Let's start with the vision. And first and foremost, all owls have very large eyes. In fact, their eyes can be up to 5% of their entire body weight. That's true for the northern saw-whet owl, which we do see in the state of Ohio. Other species, it's as low as 3%, but still that's a pretty high percentage of your entire body weight. Just for comparison, us as humans, our eyes account for about 0.0003% of our body weight. So much different. Now, the drawback for owls having such large eyes is it makes them farsighted, which means they can't see things well up close. But like lots of things in nature, they have made that adaptation, and their workaround is to use some little bristles. In fact, you can see it around the beak of this owl here. These little stiff bristles around the beak that helps them to detect objects and prey that are at close range. So those large eyes are also fixed, so they don't move. So if you think about our eyeballs, we have balls, right? So we can look left and we can look right, we can look up and down, we can move and change our range of vision without moving our heads. Owls have fixed tube-shaped eyes, so they can't move their eyes. So instead, they move their head. Now, the nice thing about having your eyes up front is you get really good binocular vision. And binocular vision just means that you're using both of your eyes, using 2 eyes to be able to see objects. So that helps with depth perception, gives you a wider range of vision. Owls have their eyeballs both in the front of their face, so it gives them a really nice 70 degrees worth of binocular vision. If you contrast that to some of our other birds, like let's use a sparrow or a robin, and their eyes are mounted, they're fixed on the sides of their heads, and so they have a very narrow space where they're using both of their eyes at the same time. So owls have a much wider view. What they've done to compensate, though, for that only 70 degrees is they have the ability to rotate their heads. Not just rotate their heads, but rotate them significantly. So we're talking 270 degrees in either direction and 90 degrees up and down. So while the owl can't do a poltergeist move and completely turn its head around, they can totally look over their shoulder at you, and it makes it look like their head is completely spun around. So imagine being able to do that 270 degrees in either direction. Another little adaptation that they have for vision has to do with those rods and cones. If you think back to science class in high school, you know that our eyes have cones and they have rods, and the cones are used to detect color and bright light, and the rods are more sensitive and better for dim light. Well, the owl eyes are packed with rods in their retinas. And so those rods, in fact, it's like a 30-to-1 ratio of rods to cones. So it's thought that they can't see color very well because they have so many rods in their eyes, but what that allows them to do is to focus and be able to see objects in really dim light because of all those rods. Another neat adaptation for vision is something called eye shine, and that just means, so there is a layer of tissue that lies behind the retina in the owl's eye, and it reflects any visible light. So the tiniest amount of light that gets in there is reflected off that eye shine, and that dramatically increases the light that's available to the owl's photoreceptors. And so that means it gets superior night vision just by having that extra layer. And finally, they've got a lot of eye protection. They have 3 eyelids, which is pretty cool, but isn't unusual. There's lots of different animals that have 3 eyelids. The top one closes to blink, the bottom one closes when they sleep, and the clear, what's called a nictitating membrane, it closes horizontally, so back and forth across the eye. And that clear membrane, it allows the owl to protect its eye while also being able to see through it. So why is that important? Well, owls are pretty savage predators, and they hit their prey with a lot of force, and being the ability to be able to close that clear eyelid and protect their eyes is really valuable as a predator. So when they hit with that impact or they're eating, they can go ahead and protect their eyes. All right, the next adaptation we're going to focus on is hearing. So right smack dab in the middle of the screen, you'll see the long-eared owl, and those are not ears though. Those are simply ear tufts. They are tufts of feather, and they are not functional for hearing. They are used for display purposes, but they are not functional. They have absolutely nothing to do with how an owl hears, but they sure do look like ears, right? So when that long-eared owl got named, well, they didn't realize at the time those weren't ears, right? So one thing you're going to notice that both of the owls that we have on the screen here, both the long-eared owl and the barn owl, both have a really clear facial disc, and all owls have a facial disc. It seems like the owls that, and it makes sense once you understand the function of it, the owls that hunt purely in the dark, like the barn owl, for example, have a really tight disc, facial disc, and this facial disc acts as a funnel to literally funnel sound into the ears of the owl. So where are the ears actually located? Well, down at the bottom, you can see a picture of an owl's ear, and they're not ears like we think of ears. Instead, they're just openings, and they're called apertures. So those apertures are found in all owls, and the shape and size depends on the species of the owl. So some have round ones, some have oval shaped ones. Many of them are offset, and by offsetting those apertures, it allows the owl to be able to triangulate and hone in on their prey. So it's really a fascinating adaptation. It's also super sensitive. So they can tell the direction of a noise almost instantaneously. They can tell whether it's coming from the left, or whether it's coming from the right. And by instantaneous, we're talking like 30 millionths of a second that it takes that owl to be able to identify where that sound is coming from. And then they can fly in the direction of that sound, and they can even make corrections on their direction or if the prey moves while they're mid-flight. I mean, think about that. How incredibly sensitive that has to be for them to be able to be flying and hunting in the dark to get their prey. Just for a couple examples, great horned owls, which do nest in Ohio and are very common in Portage County, great horned owls have been measured to be able to hear meadow vole moving through the leaves or the debris 900 feet away. Great gray owls, which unfortunately are not found in Ohio, although there are a few records of them visiting, but they are found way up north and are our largest North American owl. They can hear a beetle running through the grass 100 feet away, a beetle, or a mouse squeaking at a distance of a half a mile. Imagine that. So really, really sensitive ears. And it makes sense because most of these predators are hunting in the dark, or they're crepuscular, which means that they're hunting like at dawn and dusk. All right. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to pop those into the Q&A box and I will get to them at the end. But let's talk about feathers now. This is another adaptation that all owls have, and their feathers have really specialized functions. They do have a number of different kinds of feathers. The one in particular that I want to point out is they have these phyloplumes that are little hair-like feathers. They have a fine shaft, they have short barbs at the end, and they're actually used for pressure and vibration receptors, which makes sense when you think about how many of them are not able to see their prey really well. It just helps in that whole process. But what I really want to talk about is their silent flight. This is fascinating stuff. So if there's any aerodynamic fans in the house, then you're really going to appreciate this. So I have two. I'll show you the wings, and then I'll go ahead and show you a closer up. So I have two different wings here. There we go. Put these guys up. So this one that I'm moving is the wing of a barred owl. This wing here is the wing of a red-tailed hawk. Both of these were vehicle hits. And we do have an education permit, so we were able to acquire these to be able to use to share and give them a little life after death there. So owls have on the leading edge of their primary flight feathers, down in the bottom left picture, you can see that there are some feathery hooks, and that's called fimbriate. So it means comb-like, and it's on the leading edge of their primary wing feathers. So normally, for a normal bird, like this hawk here, in a normal bird, the air is going to rush over that surface of the wing, and it's going to create turbulence as it comes off the backside of the wing. When that turbulence happens, you get this gushing noise. And so that's the noise of a flapping wing. Now, because we're on Zoom, you're not going to be able to hear the noise. However, in person, if I flap this wing and give it a good hard flap, you're going to be able to hear the rush of air, that rush and gush of air. So, and if you look, this worked earlier. So if you look here, see how nice and crisp those edges are of the feathers? I want you to keep this picture in your mind. Look at how nice and crisp and clean the edges are of those red-tailed hawk feathers. Okay, now let's contrast that with our barred owl wing. So with owl flight, those comb-like feather edges that you see on the screen, those break up that turbulence, and they break them up in these little micro turbulences. And basically it ends up muffling the sound. So instead of getting that gush of air, you've got something to break up that air, and it muffles the sound. Now, this is really great for stealthy, silent flying, right? So now let's look at this one. Hopefully you have in your head the edges of those other flowers. Let me put up a dark surface so you can see. You see the edges of these whoopsies. There we go. See those fluffy edges of the barred owl? So those little comb-like edge on the feathers really, oh, this is an even better one. There you go. Now you can really see them. That comb-like edge on the feathers. So when I flap this wing, it is silent. All that you feel is air. You don't hear the gush. So I assume that some of you have been in the woods at night and you know how quiet it gets in the woods at night. And so if you're a big predator who's looking to hunt and swoop down and get a little mouse, you know, all the prey that's in the woods is also adapted to low light. So they are super, super aware, have great hearing. And so the last thing that you want is to make noises as you're coming in for the kill. So this kind of a wing structure makes it easy for the owl to fly undetected and almost completely silently through the woods hunting. I personally have been in the woods and felt that whoosh of air only to realize that it's an owl that has just flown by. Haven't heard it at all. So it's really an amazing adaptation. All right. Next, let's move on to the feet. So let's talk about talons. Owls do have, just like hawks, this is the foot of a red-tailed hawk. And you can see there are three talons that are on the top and one talon that's on the bottom. So that is used for grip. So those three on the front and back allow for a really good grip on a perch or a really good grip on prey. But there's something else that's extra special about the way that foot is structured, and that is it has a ratcheting action. So if there's any mechanics that are on the call tonight, you'll appreciate this. They've got a structure kind of like, has a little ratcheting mechanism in it that keeps the toes locked around the perch or locked around its prey without needing their muscles to remain contracted. So what do I mean by that? If you think of your hand grabbing onto something, you're picking up something really heavy. We have to keep our muscles contracted so that we keep our grip on that thing that we're holding. With an owl, it's mechanically ratcheting up around that prey, and they don't have to use any muscle strength to be able to keep their good grip on their perch or on their prey. Really fascinating. Other raptors also have the same kind of mechanism in their feet. One thing that does make owl feet different from other birds of prey is that their bony structures in their feet are a lot shorter and stronger than other birds. And that's because of the impact with which they hit their prey. So if you think about a hunting owl, and there's some really good, I don't have pictures of this, but if you're interested, there was a study that was done in, I believe it was 1979 was when it was published, about barn owls. And the researchers basically trained some captive barn owls to attack and go after prey when certain noises were made. And so they were trying to figure both how they could, how they could hear and locate the prey, but also to see how they actually attacked the prey. And so there's some great photos of how the owl comes in feet first once they've located the prey. And so they hit those, whoever they're after, with some serious force. And that short, strong structure in the foot helps protect their feet from the impact of that force when they make contact with their prey. And finally, lots of pressure happening here. A great horned owl, again, a common owl that we see in Portage County and here, they can exert between 200 and 500 pounds per square inch of pressure on their prey. I mean, that's enough to snap a vertebrate when they come down and get their prey. And they actually will take some pretty large animals, as we'll talk about a little bit later. All right. Finally, the last little adaptation that I want to talk about is, before we move into owls, is all about their digestion, because it's really fascinating. So hopefully everybody's already had dinner. I don't have anything too gruesome to show you, but owls don't chew. They don't chew their prey. They have that curved, sharp beak, and if the prey is small enough, they'll go ahead and just swallow the whole thing at one time. Or if it's a larger prey, they will use it to rip it apart, just like other raptors do. But because they do that, they consume all the undigestibles. So all the bones, all the fur, anything that can't be digested, they also consume, but they can't process that. So they have to have a way to get rid of that while still being able to absorb the nutrients from their meal. So they produce owl pellets. So on the top left is an owl pellet. This is not poop. This is an owl pellet. And it is super dry. In fact, I've got one here. I'll show you. This is a little owl pellet. I believe this one's from a barred owl. And the owl pellet is just made up of all of that undigested fur and bone from their prey. So how is it made? I think this is really fascinating stuff. So the food travels down their esophagus and it meets the first part of the owl's stomach. And that at that point, there's digestive enzymes that start to break down the food, and then it moves into the gizzard. Now the gizzard is a structure that many birds have that go ahead and keeps the, well, it serves different functions for different birds, but in the case of the owl, it keeps the undigestibles from moving further through the digestive tract. So all of that undigestible material will hang out in the gizzard and it will become compressed into a pellet while all the digestibles continue to move through the digestive system. But before the owl can eat its next meal, it has to get rid of the pellet. It has to get rid of all that stuff so it can make room for the next meal. So it will regurgitate the pellet before it consumes its next meal. So if you've ever heard a cat coughing up a hairball, that's basically what happens here. It only takes a couple moments and they cough up the owl pellet. And what's so cool about that, other than the fact that you've got this neat pellet that you can handle and see what's in there, is that researchers can figure out exactly what an owl is eating just based on what's in the owl pellet. Because you can reconstruct skeletons of what the owl has eaten. You can see talons of other owls because many owls are predated by other owls. So you can see whole, in fact, this is a really common activity that's used in school labs to talk about lots of things, about predator-prey relationships, about skeletal systems, and you can actually reconstruct mouse and vole and other animals based on what's inside the owl pellet. So really interesting stuff. So it's just like a big old owl hairball. So the researchers can go and study their diet and figure out what's going on in that owl's diet. Now, I should mention, just to clarify, that other raptors also produce pellets. In fact, other carnivorous birds produce pellets. Even if you go out to Trail Lake Park, one of our newest Portage County Park District, we have kingfishers that are regular residents there. Now, kingfishers eat lots of things, lots of vertebrates, and they also will produce pellets. What's unique about owl pellets is that they're usually easier to find because you'll find them underneath their regular roosting places, but they're also really compact. And so they're, some other birds' pellets aren't quite as compressed and compact. Right. So we're going to move into, I see a comment there. Yeah, lots of places will use, they really use owl pellets for education. It's really cool. So let's move into our 4 species of owls that nest in the state of Ohio. Only 3 of them nest in Portage County, but I want to make sure I include the other one since it definitely nests around us. So let's start with the great horned owl. The great horned owl is our largest nesting owl in the state of Ohio. It can reach weights of up to 5 pounds. The females are larger than the males, and they're really common. They're also really adaptable habitat-wise. So they can be in a suburban area, in an urban area, in just outside a forested area, and this is true of most owls. The great horned owl is a little bit more of a bully about it, but most owls do not build their own nests. Most owls either use, a lot of them are cavity nesters, as we'll talk about, but they use the nests of other animals. And the great horned owl in particular will use lots of other species' nests. Hawks, great blue herons, it's really common. Like if you know where a great blue heron rookery is, it's a pretty good place to look for a great horned owl nest because there's a good chance that they've taken over one of those nests, even crow nests or squirrel nests. And what's interesting about great horned owl nests is they're also really not very picky. And so, I mean, I have seen some scraggly looking great horned owl nests, and they don't use them year to year. So the next season they'll just find a new one, you know, or kick somebody off of theirs and use it. So they are also our earliest nester of the four nesters. So they actually can be on eggs in Ohio January and February. So they're right now they are, you know, incubating, and those little babies are going to be popping out here. And it's a good one thing to look for. If you look in the bottom right hand corner, that picture shows a great horned owl on the nest. Sometimes if they're in a large nest or they're incubating their eggs and so the female is down on the eggs, you won't even be able to see her. But look for those little hair tufts, those little ear tufts, the feathered ear tufts, and that'll be the clue. So you really have to put your owl eyes on when you're looking for owls, because they're so good at camouflaging, and which makes sense because they do most of their hunting and their activity in the evening. And so during the day, they're out in the open taking a nap. And so they need to camo just to make sure that that keeps them safe. All right. Two things about IDing or finding great horned owls that I think are valuable, if you've especially if you've never seen one before. One thing is to look for the harassers. So crows in particular cannot stand great horned owls. And so if they see one during the day roosting, they will make a big old fuss over it. So it will be continuous, and they will just be harassing it. And so if you see that happening, they'll do the same to raptors too, but a lot of hawks will just take off pretty quick. So that's one thing to look for. If you see the crows harassing, see what it's harassing. Blackbirds and blue jays will also do the same thing. You can also let your nose be your guide. Great horned owls are one of our more savage predators, and they also have the most varied diet of any of the owls. One of their favorite things to eat are striped skunks, and they don't seem to be, you know, bothered at all by the smell of a skunk, but when they kill a skunk, it's on them. And if you've ever had a dog get sprayed by a skunk, you know that that is a hard smell to get out. So if you're walking along and you smell a skunk, but it smells like it's coming from up above, that's a good indication to, you know, take a look up and see if it happens to be a great horned owl. All right. Next up is my favorite of our nesting owls in the state of Ohio, and that's the barred owl. Oh, I almost forgot. I was able to get, my audio wasn't working earlier, and so, but I figured out a workaround. So I want to go back, and first I'm going to play you the sound of the great horned owl. This is probably familiar to most of you. So you have that hoo hoo hoo, and then you've got the callback of the whoos. So to me, the great horned owl is the most characteristic hooting owl that we have. But the barred owl has a really, really fun call, and it really is easily imitated. But the barred owl sounds like this. Maybe this. All right, so that's the barred owl. Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all? And they will give that call repeatedly. However, one thing this recording doesn't share is what happens when a couple barred owls start communicating. They are very, very chatty. So they can also elicit some pretty scary, pretty creepy sounds. So it might start off with the who cooks for you all, but it can escalate into all kinds of noises coming from those two owls. So just know if you're hearing some crazy owlish things, it's probably a barred owl. because they can really get going. They also, I should point out, are one of only two of our dark-eyed owls in Ohio. The rest all have yellow eyes, but the barred owl and the barn owl both have dark eyes. And the barred owl, though it's really common, it really is a true forest species. It prefers forested ravines and wet woods. Those would be its preference, but you will find them. In fact, one of our attendees mentioned, seeing them roosting in a backyard adjacent to a park, and that's pretty common too. But this time of year, they start nesting in March, and so we should be hearing the ramping up of their calls this month. All right, that's the barred owl. Next up, we have the eastern screech owl. Now, these little guys are fun for a few reasons. If you look in the picture, I'll point this out before I play its call. The eastern screech owl is the only owl in North America that has two different color morphs. Now, these are not color stages or changes. They're either born gray or they're born red. So, beautiful, beautiful owl. It's a tiny owl, and it is the most common owl that we have in the state of Ohio. These little guys are all over the place. So the owl that you're most likely to see in Portage County is a screech owl. But first you have to find it, because they are masters of camouflage. So I'm going to play the call for you just so you can, it doesn't sound as screechy. I mean, it's kind of a delightful little call. So that's the screech owl. Sort of sounds like a ping pong ball, just a lovely little owl. And they nest in cavities. So as do the barred owls, but the eastern screech owls nest in cavities. They will use woodpecker cavities often. I've read that they are really partial to northern flicker cavities, but you'll see them in squirrel cavities. You'll see them in holes in the tree from a broken off limb. I mean, they really utilize those tree cavities. And so my recommendation to you is, when you're at parks that have, and we have a lot of them, when you're at parks that have American beech trees, those are great trees to really give a second look to at all the little nooks and crannies, because sometimes you'll only see, like if you look at this gray morph here, you'll only see their little head peeking out of the hole. Sometimes you won't even see the entire owl. You'll just see a little bit of its head, and boy, doesn't it look just like bark on the tree. Same thing goes for the red morph. I've seen these before in a break off on a tree and sitting there, and you wouldn't have even known it was there. So really good masters of camouflage. They tend to eat smaller rodents, and they're a real adaptable owl as well. All right, the last of our 4 nesting owls, or at least regularly nesting owls in Ohio, is the barn owl. And the barn owl, there are no nesting records for the barn owl in Portage County. So if you know of a barn owl that's nesting in Portage County, then shoot me a message, because we need to get that info to the Division of Wildlife. But the barn owl, it does make sense where their nests are found, because they are a meadow, open land, grassland bird. They're aptly named because most of the ones we have in Ohio use barns to nest in. They also are really responsive to to nest boxes. So if you have an open area and you've got, there's barn owls in the vicinity, if you put up a barn owl box, it's, increases your chances of getting them to nest there. They prey almost exclusively on meadow voles. So they're really dependent on good hunting habitat to be able to breed and survive successfully. Now, this is interesting about the barn owl. A lot of our owls are mostly nocturnal, but will be active in those crepuscular times of day, that dusk and dawn time. And the barn owl, though, is one that hunts exclusively in darkness. And they have that really tight facial disc. They're also the other owl that has the dark eyes instead of the yellow eyes. And before somebody asks the question, I don't know, because I have this question now for myself. I don't know if that makes a difference, makes any difference functionally to them. So they hunt in complete darkness. They have a really amazing ability to hone in on their prey without even being able to see it. So really, really remarkable owl. I'm going to play its call, which is a little freaky. I'm just going to warn you. So way more of a screech than a hoot, right? And how scary would that be if you're out walking outside and hear that in the middle of the night? Might give you a little bit of a start. So that is the barn owl. Now the next 4 owls that we're gonna go through here, just to close out the owl evening, are the 4 owls that that don't nest here regularly. I say regularly because all 4 of them do have nesting records in the state of Ohio, but they're few and far between. So don't get too excited when you see the range map, because a few of them have nesting records in Portage County, but definitely ones to keep an eye out. And I don't know if I mentioned before the program started, but I'll mention it now, that all 4 of these are either winter visitors or they're just here as they're migrating south. By now, they start coming, moving south in November, and then now in March they're going to be, headed back north. So they nest anywhere from the upper part of the US, but mostly up into Canada, and some even up into the Arctic. So these are definitely northern owls that occasionally will nest here, but will frequently visit here. So just know that next year, if you missed the window for this year, next year you'll know when to keep a lookout for them. I'm not going to be playing calls for these 4. We're just going to be talking about some of their characteristics. So the first one of the 8 that I'm sharing tonight, this one is my favorite. This is the northern saw-whet owl. It is the smallest owl that we have in the state of Ohio, and it weighs in at a whole whopping 3 ounces. So it's a little guy and girl. And they almost exclusively eat mice, specifically white-footed mice. Now, if you know anything about small rodents, you know that white-footed mice tend to live in the forest. So it makes sense then that this would be considered a forest owl. So they rarely breed in Ohio. It's exciting that we have that breeding record in Ohio, in Portage County, but they rarely breed here. They are more of a boreal forest nester, and they will often roost really low in trees. I'll share my first experience with this northern saw-whet owl. This is probably why it's one of my favorites. I was in college taking my first ornithology class, which is the study of birds, and I was visiting on a trip to Killdeer Plains, which is in Wyandotte County out in northwest Ohio. And this is a really prime wildlife area for winter roosting owls. And we were actually there to look and observe long-eared owls, which there were plenty of. But while we were binoculars in the air looking around for these long-eared owls, one of my classmates in a whisper says, "You guys, look." And we turn around, and there, I'm 5'4", 5 feet off the ground on a branch, is this little saw-whet owl just taking a nap, sleeping away, eyes closed, right next to us, just a few feet in front of us. So we all slowly backed up and gave it plenty of room, but we would have bumped right into it had he not noticed it. So they are just adorable little owls, and I sure hope that all of you get a chance to see one at some point. We do see them in Portage County. I will share one little factoid about the northern saw-whet owl that's interesting. Is it used to be thought that they were very rare to see in the state of Ohio, but there was a northern saw-whet owl banding project that was started a number of years ago. The closest banding site that I know where they're doing the study to us is at Mount Union's Nature Center south of Alliance. But what they've found is they're way more abundant and common during the winter and during migration than originally was thought. So there's a better chance than we used to think for you to be able to see them. All right, next up, we're going to sadly move away from the northern saw-whet owl to the stately long-eared owl. And they are named appropriately if only those were ears. Remember, these are feather tufts. They are not ears. Their ears are located on the sides of their heads near their facial disc, just under that facial disc. So the long-eared owl also has a record in Portage County, but very, very rarely nests in, almost never nests in Ohio. And they love to roost in mature pine trees. They're also a northern woodland owl species. They're very common winter residents at Killdeer Plains in Wyandotte County. That's a great place to see them in the winter. And they tend to be community roosters. So you usually will find multiple long-eared owls at one time. I've seen as many as 10 in one tree or near each other. And they camouflage themselves so well. So if you look at the bottom right-hand photo on the screen, I mean, if you weren't zoomed in on that owl, you would think that it was just part of the tree. It was another branch. So really hard to see. Again, they rarely nest here, but wow, they're a stately looking bird. Sticking with the ears that are not ears, our next owl is the short-eared owl. Now, when they're in flight, you don't see the little short ears, which remember are just feather tufts. But if you look at the picture on the right, you see those two little bumps, which is where it got its name, short-eared owl. Once you see a short-eared owl, either in flight or on the ground, you just won't forget it. And you'll never have trouble identifying them after that. So when they fly, they have really long, broad wings, and they've been described, I think, pretty appropriately, looking like a giant moth. So they just get a real good flap going, just like watching a big moth flying through the air. And when they land, when they're sitting on the ground, and they do spend a lot of time on the ground or on fence posts, you'll see them a lot. They come from up in the Arctic, and so they prefer these wide open spaces. When they're sitting on the ground, I think they look a lot like a chicken with a big round head, just how they're sitting there. So they really are a unique body shape and form. They are ground nesters. So if they do nest in Ohio, they will build their nest, and by build, and this is our only nest builder of the owls that we're talking about today, and by build I mean they're just like scraping some things together behind some tall grasses. So it is not what you would think of as a well-designed and constructed nest. But you also will see these during the day. So you notice both of the pictures on the screen were taken during daylight hours. This is one of the owls that is diurnal. It will be hunting during the day, although it tends to be more mornings and evenings. Oh, and they primarily eat meadow voles. So if you think back, what was the other owl that only or primarily eats meadow voles? And that was the barn owl. So both of these species are those meadow hunters, and they subsist almost entirely on meadow voles. And if you don't know what a meadow vole is, I should have stuck a picture in. A meadow vole is a small rodent. It looks a lot like a mouse if you haven't observed them before, but they have tiny little ears instead of large mouse ears, and they have little to no tail. So they're like a nice chunky little delectable treat for an owl and for lots of other animals. I mean, it's really, they're a major part of the food chain. All right. We're going to end on a high note here with our snowy owl. The snowy owl is rarely found down in Portage County, and only a handful of them show up in Ohio every winter. In fact, if you look at the range map, the winter distribution map, it's really up along the Lake Erie coast. And the few places that I'll say are every year you're almost sure to see them, there's usually a visitor or two at Burke Lakefront. There are some spots out in Lorain County that often will get snowy owls visiting. And they are they're tundra residents. They live and breed and eat up in the tundra. And the only reason they come down here, and it's always the younger ones, it's not the adults. The adults are full white, completely white, no black barring on them, but we rarely see those. We tend to see the younger ones that have more of the black and white coloring on them. The snowy owls eat almost exclusively lemmings. So lemmings are like a giant meadow vole. So they're a larger, but still a pretty small rodent. And lemmings are their primary source of food. So the snowy owl populations fluctuate depending on the lemming populations. So if there's a big boost, it's a great growing season, there's lots of lemmings, they're super healthy, well, that's lots of food for the snowy owls. And birds are pretty fascinating. We could do a whole program on this, but birds are pretty fascinating in their reproduction and what triggers that and how many eggs they lay in a clutch. So when food is abundant, the birds produce more eggs and more chicks are successfully raised. And so if there's a big boom in the lemming population, that often results in a big boom in the owl population. But you know there's going to be a tipping point at some point, right? So at some point, if there's a hard winter or something happens and there's just not enough lemmings to support the owl population, then those owls are going to continue to move further south in search of enough food. So same thing that happens with a lot of our resident birds in Ohio through the winter. The one that comes to mind is bluebirds. So eastern bluebirds don't migrate unless there's no food. You know, if there's not enough food here, if we have a particularly hard winter and they can't find any, enough berries to subsist on, then they will move further south until they have enough food. So that's what happens with the snowy owls moving into Ohio. And so while we have a handful, and I'm talking, like less than 10 a year that come into that northern part of the state, some years we have what's called an eruption. Not the eruption like a volcano, but an eruption, which is a big boom in the owl population where suddenly you have massive numbers of snowy owls or other species. This year we had an eruption of like evening grosbeaks and pine siskins and crossbills that came down to Ohio that aren't usually seen. But when a snowy owl eruption happens, I mean, it makes the news because these are the largest owls that we will see regularly in Ohio. The females can weigh over 6 pounds. And so they really, you can't miss them. And they hunt during the day. They're active during the day and they're on the ground most of the time or on like low fence posts. And so they're really, really visible. So it's hard to ignore a big snowy owl eruption. The first snowy owl that I ever saw in person that wasn't in a zoo, or in a rehab facility was in 2013 when there was the largest eruption of snowy owls that we have ever had in the state of Ohio. And previous to that, just to give you some historical data, in 1926 and 27, so the winter of 26 and 27, there were 138 snowy owls that were spotted in the state of Ohio. It was considered a pretty big eruption at the time. In 1941 and 42, that winter, there were 150 snowy owls that were found in the state of Ohio. In 2013 and 14, we had a record 177 snowy owls observed in 60 of the 88 counties in the state of Ohio. Isn't that amazing? So they were all over the place. And the one that I saw was actually in Holmes County, all the way south of us. So in those eruption years, wow, that's awfully special. But just know that almost every year, if you want to see a snowy owl, you can. They will be around. And of course, they've gotten more after Harry Potter came out. They really took off in popularity. They got a boost. So, well, I hope you've enjoyed learning about the individual owls themselves and some of the adaptations that make them so amazing. So I want to close tonight with just some tips on how we can help the owls, also how we can find the owls, and how we can respectfully and ethically observe the owls. So first, habitat conservation. Owls are apex predators. In fact, most owls' biggest natural predator are other owls. So, great horned owls, will feast on barred owls and screech owls, but they don't really have anybody that's feasting on them. We as humans do contribute to a lot of owl deaths, whether it's by vehicle accidents, like what happened to, our demo owls here tonight, or by poison because remember, lots of them eat rodents, especially, if there's meadow rodents, and if you're using rodenticides, that can impact the owl when they eat it, just moves through the food chain. Or even from accidental shootings, things like that. So habitat conservation, though, because the number one reason for owl deaths is starvation, and that just means there's not enough food for them. And so by providing good habitat for meadow voles and other small rodents, we increase the overall health of the ecosystem. So habitat conservation is a really strong point to remember. By providing that habitat for the food that goes up the food chain to these magnificent predators, it can make a difference in continuing their life cycle successfully. So let's say you want to find some owls. You've never seen one, and I've just told you that we are surrounded by screech owls. Then what do you look for? So look for signs for the owls. So first, look for owl pellets. Remember I said earlier when we were talking about owl pellets that the pellets are often found under favorite roosting sites. So some owls won't roost at the same location, but if they have a favorite spot, then you're going to find owl pellets underneath it. So keep an eye out for owl pellets on the ground. So instinctively we look up, and sometimes we just need to look down. The second thing to look for is something called whitewashing on trees. Basically, the owl's sitting there eating, it's sitting there processing the food, and it's excreting the food too. And so their excrement is really white and will look almost like white paint has been dumped down the side of a tree. And so if you have an owl that's frequently roosting at the same place, you'll get a buildup of that whitewashing. So that's something to look for. But remember that if you do suspect an owl, or if you are lucky enough to see an owl, please keep your distance. Owls are really sensitive, and it's challenging for them to find good roosting spots anyway. So you certainly want to make sure that you keep your distance. If you're on one of the trails and you see one, please stay on the trail. And they just give them their distance, and keep an eye out too, literally an eye out. Keep your eyes on their eyes if you're using binoculars, because a happy owl is an owl that has its eyes closed or almost closed. When you see those eyes wide open, that indicates that they're starting to get stressed and on alert. And when you see their body position change, so they get tall and kind of puff up or thin out, and their feather tufts get more upright, those are all signs of stress in an owl. So no great picture is worth disturbing these amazing creatures. So keep your distance if you are lucky enough to see one. Next, I just want to remind you to avoid doing any owl calling, like playing. You can use these. There's lots of different apps and recordings that are out there to help, but those are designed as an educational tool to help teach you what to listen for when you're out birding or out enjoying the parks or your backyard. The reason to avoid calling, and I know that there are organizations that do, like owl prowls and different things like that, where they'll play owl calls, but the challenge there is that it really disrupts the territory and the behavior of the owls, particularly if that's done anytime in or around nesting season. Because these owls, like any other critter that's trying to find a mate, they are focused in, they get a lot more territorial, and you don't want to either pull an owl off a nest or disrupt any kind of mating behavior. So it's better just to learn them in the comfort of your own home, and then when you're headed out, look for the signs of the owls. You're more likely to hear them close to dark. So if you like, our parks are open dawn through dusk, you can do a near dusk walk and definitely hear them. Be out early in the morning and hear them. And this time of year, because the barred owls and the screech owls are all nesting, starting to nest right now, they're pretty vocal. So you might hear them, at odd times of the day too. And then finally, when you do, and I'm going to say when, because I'm speaking this into being for all of you, you are going to see an owl. And I want you to enjoy the moment, because they really are so magical. And we are so fortunate to have at least 3 species in Portage County that are often around. So I really appreciate your attention tonight, and I thank you for joining us.